We propose to extend temporary protection until March 4, 2028. At the same time, our proposal takes into account Ukraine's changing needs in defense and recovery. Temporary protection should not be granted to newly arriving individuals who are prohibited from leaving Ukraine under Ukrainian law due to their military obligations. The European Union has nevertheless decided to deport Ukrainian men of conscription age back to Ukraine and no longer grant them temporary protection status. But the European Union will continue to accept Russian soldiers who fought against Ukraine. The European Commission has proposed to extend the Temporary Protection Directive for Ukrainian refugees until March 4, 2028, while at the same time restricting access to this status for some new applicants. The European Commission stated that they held negotiations with the Ukrainian authorities and concluded that Ukrainian men should remain in Ukraine to defend the country from the Russian attack. Therefore, they are not welcome in Europe and will not be accepted. However, there are some very important nuances here, which we will discuss in this episode. But the European Commission still could not make a different decision regarding Russians. Italy and France questioned the EU's plan to ban entry for former Russians in the 21st sanctions package. They remain skeptical and believe Ukrainians should stay protected. As part of the 21st package of sanctions, entry is banned for former Russian military personnel who participated in the war against Ukraine. Italy and France are still willing to welcome those same Russian occupiers who killed Ukrainians in the war and are now trying to enter Europe. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic together calmly, without unnecessary emotions. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and leave any comment under this video. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechiy News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So, the European Commission has proposed to extend the directive on temporary protection for Ukrainian refugees until March 4, 2028, while at the same time limiting access to this status for some new Ukrainian applicants. As you can imagine, this is specifically about men of conscription age. This was reported by the European Commissioner for Migration, Magnus Brunner. According to the proposal, temporary protection should not be granted to newly arrived Ukrainian citizens who are prohibited from leaving Ukraine due to mobilization. Moreover, Brunner stated directly that the Ukrainian authorities strongly requested them to make such a decision. According to him, the decision takes into account Ukraine's defense needs and the necessity of its post-war recovery. He said that at this stage, Ukraine needs men to replenish the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine, and they should not be allowed to leave the country so that they can work on rebuilding Ukraine after the war is over.
And as long as the war continues, our support must continue.
Since the war continues, our support of course must continue. That is why today we are presenting a proposal to extend temporary protection for another year.
To be continued, expire in March 2027.
The current temporary protection regime expires in March 2027, and March 2027 is essentially just around the corner. We need to ensure continuity, clarity, and of course stability, so we propose to extend temporary protection until March 4, 2028.
This will allow us to protect
families who have built their lives in Europe and integrate them into host societies. For example, by finding a job, contributing to the European Union's economy, learning the language, studying at school, starting a business, and so on. At the same time, our proposal takes into account Ukraine's changing needs for defense and recovery, and this issue is pending. It was widely discussed with our Ukrainian partners, our Ukrainian friends, and of course with our member states as well. In order for the protection system to remain reliable and meet Ukraine's legitimate needs, we are proposing a targeted adjustment.
We are proposing a targeted adjustment. It matched.
Our proposal stipulates that temporary protection should not be granted to newly arriving individuals who, under Ukrainian law, are prohibited from leaving Ukraine due to their military obligations. And this is exactly what Ukraine asked us for, and this is exactly what we are doing. This also reflects, of course, the discussions with member states, especially those that are hosting the largest number of Ukrainian refugees. But there are, of course, exceptions to the rules. Ukrainians
who are in the European Union, which hosts the largest number of Ukrainian refugees, will retain their temporary protection.
Under temporary protection. Moreover, this same Brunner presented it as a matter of human rights protection. And the fact that these Ukrainians have already managed to integrate into European society, which, by the way, suggests that returning these Ukrainians is extremely difficult because Europe simply won't give them back just like that. Next, a quote from Brunner. This will protect families who have built their lives in Europe and integrated into the host society, found jobs, contribute to the European Union's economy, learn the language, study in schools, or have started businesses. At the moment, according to the European Commission, almost 4.5% have temporary protection status in the European Union. Миллиона украинцев. At the same time, Brussels has called on EU countries to prepare for the gradual phasing out of the temporary protection regime. The European Commission proposes to expand opportunities for Ukrainians to transition to long-term residence permits, as well as to develop voluntary return and reintegration programs in Ukraine. Together with member states and Kyiv, it is planned to launch a pilot program for the voluntary return of Ukrainians to their homeland. If the situation in Ukraine stabilizes, the European Commission reserves the right to terminate the temporary protection regime at any time. And so, on the one hand, certain EU countries have already created mechanisms for transitioning from temporary protection. Well, for example, Spain has introduced an official mechanism that allows you to quickly and easily switch from temporary protection to a standard residence permit and work without leaving Spain and without having to apply for a visa abroad. The Spanish authorities decided to make the transition to a long-term residence permit as easy as possible for all Ukrainians who already live and work in Spain. On the other hand, some EU countries are already considering tightening the rules, primarily for men. The Danish authorities have proposed to stop granting temporary protection to Ukrainian men aged 20 to 60 who do not have an exemption from military service. According to the bill, such citizens will no longer be able to obtain a residence permit under the special law on the protection of Ukrainians. And in Copenhagen, they explained that the residency rules should not be used to avoid military service in Ukraine. I should note here that Denmark simply has its own separate immigration status. And Denmark, by the way, may not comply with Brussels' decisions and can make completely autonomous decisions on this issue. So if Denmark is already lobbying for this, they can really adopt it on their own territory, even if hypothetically the European Union adopts some other directive. And in Poland, control over granting temporary protection has also been strengthened. Polish authorities have started to deny this status to Ukrainians more often. This applies to both new applicants and those who have lost their status after being absent from Poland for a long time. According to the publication, the authorities have started to check more carefully whether a person really left Ukraine because of the war, or simply left, for example, from the western part of the country. Germany, Austria, and Sweden also support denying temporary protection to conscripts, that is, men of mobilization age. But there is an important point. The European Commission's proposal must be agreed upon by all EU member states. And here problems may arise because it is difficult to explain from a legal point of view why Europe separates asylum seekers based on sex. After all, absolutely any likely restrictions will apply exclusively to men, that is, to people of the male gender. But I would like to remind you that there are also women in Ukraine who are subject to military duty, and the new mechanism will not apply to them. In addition, it is worth noting once again that even if Europe does make such a decision, it will only take effect in March 2027 and only for newly arrived men. Everyone who is currently in Europe will remain under temporary protection. There will be no mass deportations of men from Europe to Ukraine. If they are already there, it will be harder to bring them back, much harder than many people in Ukraine think. And since, well, no law has retroactive effect. The European Union plans to make a final decision regarding the status of Ukrainian refugees in July 2026, that is, literally in just a few weeks. If they don't manage to do this in July, then there will be a break and they'll return to this in September. On the other hand, Europe's decisions sometimes come as a big surprise. Two European Union countries, Italy and France, have expressed skepticism toward the EU's proposal to ban entry as part of the 21st package of sanctions for former Russian military personnel who participated in the war against Ukraine. Bloomberg reports this, citing diplomatic sources, and according to Bloomberg, Rome and Paris generally do not object to the idea of not allowing participants of the Russian invasion of Ukraine to enter. However, they are concerned that the current wording could pave the way for a blanket ban on entry for all Russians. And so both countries insist that such targeted restrictions should be regulated through visa policy, not through sanctions mechanisms. In addition, European diplomats point out the practical difficulty of implementation because EU member states would have to determine on their own who exactly fought and who did not fight. Well, it's obvious that Moscow won't provide such data. The initiative to ban entry for militants of the so-called special military operation, that is, Russian stinking occupiers, is not new. In March, the leaders of Germany, the Baltic countries, Finland, Poland, Romania, and Sweden had already sent a letter to the head of the European Council, Antonio Costa, and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, demanding a ban on entry into the Schengen zone to participants in the invasion of Ukraine, pointing to a security threat. Well, they say these are wild Russian occupiers, and they shouldn't be allowed into civilized Europe. These are savages who have also fought and killed people. Well, how can such savages be allowed into Europe? And meanwhile, within the EU, disagreements over visa policy towards Russians persist. And in June, members of the European Parliament, specifically those from the ruling CDU-CSU party in Germany, called for a complete ban on tourist visas for Russian citizens. Expressing outrage that more than 500,000 Russians spent their vacation in Europe last year, 500,000 Russians simply traveled as tourists. It would seem that in Russia, Vladimir Putin is shouting that they are fighting against all of Europe, that Europe is bad, that Europe is attacking them. 500,000 Russians left, vacationed, and returned. That's it. But, as you can see, the European Commission has definitely decided not to let some Ukrainians in, but as for the Russians, they're still thinking about it. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so financially with any donation or by subscribing to the private community on Patreon. All the links and details are in the description of this video. Check them out, subscribe, and support. I would really appreciate it. That's all for now. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.